This you shared with me. This is written by a woman named Mandy Statmiller, I think. Well, Rabbit Hole number 78. Dana Rivers is the story the media doesn't want you to read. This is a story unparalleled in media censorship about deadly white male violence against a lesbian interracial couple and their black son. When the media goes silent, there is always a reason why. Mandy gives a trigger warning in this piece. You give me a trigger warning when you shared it with me.
Which I almost never do.
You don't, yeah. And the story warrants it. This is so horrifying. You really can't imagine what is going on. But the very thumbnail version is that this guy started, claims to be trans, started invading women's spaces, including, for instance, this, I think it's called Mishfest. I may have this wrong, but the famous and long-lasting women's music festival in Michigan that was held every summer until these trans women started invading it with violence and aggression and all of this, and they basically had to shut it down. So, yet another example of women's spaces not being allowed to be women's spaces because people who aren't women get to say they're women, and somehow you're not allowed to say, no, you're not. This man is so full of rage, and particularly at one of the women in this interracial lesbian couple, that he showed up at their house and he killed both of the women and their 19-year-old son, who happened to have been adopted as, I think, a baby from Africa. He had just graduated from high school. He was a stellar student. He was going on to great things, and he slaughtered all of them. And the number of things that he did to the woman whom he hated most as he killed her are extraordinary. We've not heard about this story.
That's the other story.
What we did hear about, apparently, and I don't remember this, but what Mandy, the author of this piece, reports is that this guy, Dana Rivers, was lauded in the liberal media back in the 90s when he first came out as trans, and was just a media darling for a while for being so brave. And the fact is that he never really passed. And so women who saw him coming into women's spaces would say things to him. And on some of those women, he took out his rage to such a degree that they're now dead, brutally so. And he is likely to be, he took away the iPad or something of the young man who he killed. And he was still wearing it on his person when he turned himself in. So, there's really no ambiguity about whether or not he committed these crimes. But because of new law in California, at the point that he's convicted, he's going to go to women's prison.
Yeah, it's really, and we pointed out years ago at this point that this was the danger, that, we're talking about all kinds of things that are, yes, horrifying, like the fact that men can now compete against women in women's sports.
Yeah.
But that the deep end of the pool really is prison, right? At the point that somebody can decide that they go to a women's prison, irrespective of what they've been convicted of, irrespective of what what phenotype they have.
Just show my screen here. These are the people who were killed while we talk.
But, this is a completely unfudgeable issue, right? The fact is, men who are capable of raping women should not be in a women's prison. Now, in this case, you've got a guy who is not only physically enabled as a man, he still retains his penis, but he is obviously, there's so many quotes in this thing that make it clear that this is the most deeply misogynistic person, right? In fact, there's one
violently, rape fantasy that he published as porn on Amazon, and some of it is still up.
Yes, multiple books that he has self-published on Amazon that contain just the most twisted and bizarre, the most extreme anti-female kinds of sex, rape, violent fantasy stuff that the idea that any court would do anything other than look at him and say, no, dude, you're going to a maximum security men's prison is, that's the only rational thing to do with somebody this depraved and dangerous.
That's right.
And the fact, I really see this as two stories. One, there is the terrifying, very awful story that Mandy Stettmiller has written here.
Yeah.
And then there's the story of the fact that it's not being covered.
Yeah.
Right? You are being told, we are all being told that trans is an important issue and that in order for justice to prevail, we must provide the right to self-define.
Yeah.
Okay. Then some of us say, well, in principle, you should have the right to self-define until you get to the place where that's a threat to other people's rights. And then there's something that absolutely has to be discussed. Oh, really? You really want to keep these people from enjoying the protection of a space that matches their internal sense of themselves?
Yes.
No, I'm most worried about prison. Like, let's go to the prison.
No, but also,
of course,
women are allowed to have women-only spaces. Men are allowed to have men-only spaces too.
Of course, but
right?
My point isn't that that's an ambiguous case. My point is we have a perfectly unambiguous case. There's no argument to be made that a person like this belongs in a women's prison because he says so. Well, really, you think somebody would identify as female just to go to a women's prison? Yes, I do, and I've said so before this case became public, right? Okay.
Well, and that's, the other guy from the Wee Spa thing, he says as much in his answer. This is part of why I feel very confident about my assessment of him. Is he says, well, I've just really felt this way, and also prison wasn't a good match for me. Like, of course men's prison isn't a good match for you. It's a good match for just about anyone.
Right.
Like, are you joking?
It's not.
It's just so obvious a thing to say, and to think that's like, well, that must mean I'm a woman inside. It's like, no, that means prison sucks.
But I'm trying to get at this other point, which is, okay, people on side A said, in order to be just, in order to be kind, in order to be decent, we must carve out the space to self-define. Then some of us said, that is going to cause you problems when you get to things like women's sports, women-only spaces, women's prison. And they said, no, it won't, because that would require somebody to identify as female in order to game the system, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, happens all the time. Really? No, it doesn't happen. You're exaggerating how often it happens. Hey, take a look at this, the most horrifying story of a violent, sexually motivated murder by somebody who just happens to have self-published several books, in which he explores these kind of depraved fantasies. So this is the end of that argument.
Yep.
Except it took Mandy Stettmiller to write it on her Substack in order for us even to have access to the case. Right. Because the point is the system is now so biased in favor of this argument that it will actually obscure a case like this.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's been now at least many days since I read it, so I don't remember if I've got this exactly right. But, what was I going to say? I've now lost it. It'll come back.
Okay. Let me read a couple things,
Yeah.
and it'll come back to you.
You have a shot?
Sure. To paraphrase Spiked Online, how you identify as a man matters about as much as whether you feel like your criminality is actually justified and fully righteous because all the women you've assaulted deserved it. Imagine if serial killers and child rapists could start to identify as being innocent, and that was respected too. Identity is an insult to the brutality of reality. Reality is that almost 100% of those convicted of sexual violence are male, 98% to be exact. In UK prisons, almost half of those who identify with synthetic sex identities have been convicted of sexual offenses. Incidentally, the phrase synthetic sex identities is excellent, and that is what is being used here to indicate those who are trying to pass as the sex that they are not. There is not a female prisoner on earth who deserves the punishment of being housed with Dana Rivers, a psychopathic, revenge-obsessed male who has already taken the lives of 2 women and their family. I ask you, how many more women does Rivers have to kill before all the request to be kind becomes a little too much for all of us to bear? Got it?
So, yeah, I do have it.
Good.
2 things. One, let us just notice that the fools who have engineered our new system, their logic, right, that in fact, even, we've used these same cases before, but Caitlyn Jenner did not win the men's decathlon, right? Bruce Jenner did. It is absurd to have a system in which we cannot talk about Bruce Jenner's, it is perfectly valid to say Bruce Jenner won the men's decathlon, later transitioned to become Caitlyn Jenner, who identifies as female. That is all factual, but we're not allowed to say it because of this phony concept of dead naming. Now, here's the thing.
Right.
This absurd idea that you should be able to identify as innocent is actually perfectly logically consistent with the idea that dead naming is a problem.
Say that sentence again.
The idea that you could identify as innocent to escape responsibility for a crime is perfectly logically consistent with the idea that it is wrong to dead name Caitlyn Jenner by talking about her Olympic triumph as Bruce, right? The point is, if you can forbid us to talk about the actual manner in which you won some award in the past, then you can also walk away from a crime that you've committed because you are now identifying as somebody different. This is a new person. Yeah. That person is dead. Oh, yes, he committed a crime, but he is now dead, right? That is nonsense.
Is there any chance, I would not have expected to find myself steel-manning any part of their argument, but is there any chance that they are a little bit confused by the fact that for some crimes, intent does matter, right? That murder and manslaughter are actually different crimes, even if the effect on the person who's been killed is the same.
I don't quite get your argument. I mean, I would say intent always matters, right? There is gross negligence, but it's very different than murder.
But you're, I don't care if you think you're innocent. If you're not, you're not. I do care a little bit if you were trying to kill that person as opposed to if you weren't killing that person, because it says some different things about your mental state and who you are as a human being and what your likelihood is of doing such a thing again in the future.
Right. I mean, what?
So I guess because intent is a feature of the mind, it does take it into the space of, well, I'm just creating it. Like this is something that bubbles up from my mind, and therefore maybe all reality is like that.
Okay.
That's what it's doing.
I'd be more
here.
sympathetic to the steel manning if the very people who would be confused in this way were not also the people who claim intent doesn't matter, right? So they make that argument, and so it certainly is not exonerating here. But the other thing that is true is, look, even if we steelman their gender position, your gender identity died with that past name, and this new name that you have identified with is your new gender identity. There is nothing in the world that says that your murderous persona died with your gender identity, right? If you're a person prone to murder, if you're a person who hates women, I don't care that you do or you don't identify as one. My expectation is you didn't give up your hatred of women because you suddenly identified as one. And in fact, there's a terrible, I think it is at this festival that you were describing, where this guy is terrorizing lesbians at this music festival. But at some point, he is assaulting some woman, and he says something like, real women have cocks or something.
It's right here. A flyer. One particularly revolting flyer left for lesbians featured a man with a synthetic sex identity on the cover whose erect penis dominated the page. Underneath the words, real women have cocks.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is, I don't really care, even if the guy genuinely did identify as female. The point is, he's got a murderous rage at women, and the whole idea of, dead identity doesn't make any sense. But the point I had forgotten earlier was that in this piece, it is also clear that many people who are ideologically committed to this fantasy world in which your gender identity is something you are just free to embrace at any moment and walk away from your past life, there's a point at which this man's crimes have been revealed, and there are gender activists who are making excuses for him. And in fact, there's a question, somebody is quoted as saying, well, I don't want to judge him for what he's done until we know what these people did to him.
That's right.
Right? And it's the most bone-chilling rationalization you've ever heard, right? The guy has flown into a murderous rage and killed 3 people, a lesbian couple and their son. This is a former teacher.
Right. He's also a former teacher.
So this is not somebody who's so mentally disabled that he doesn't know what he's doing. This is somebody who delights in this stuff and writes about it. And in any case, the idea that, we shouldn't want to pass judgment on this person who is, I hesitate to recount how horrifying what he did to these people is.
Yeah.
But the idea that we shouldn't pass judgment until we figure out whether they did something that might have, in some sense, justified this. I'm sorry, no. Just because this all flies in the face of the stupid story you told us about how safe it would be for everybody to self-identify their gender, on a whim, right? This is the story that says that's not true. And now you're not going to report it in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of the other places that it should be discussed? Really? You're not going to report it? And when it is discussed in other circles, you're going to make excuses for this person? Like, how wrong? No, you were wrong. You were wrong in the first place. And we are entitled now, these people had to die in order to prove that we were right, that this was a danger? No.
No, they shouldn't have had to. They were innocent.
Yeah.
And they were living lives that benefited from some of the great successes of liberal advances of the 20th century, right? This was a black and a white woman living together in love, having adopted a black son whom they raised to be an excellent young man. And they're all dead. And the race of the dude who killed them shouldn't matter at all. But all of these people who would have us believe in the progressive stack, and that the more points you have against you because of historical injustice, the more right you have to speak. The white dude who slaughtered these 3 people brutally is being protected by the media because he pulled the trump card that is, I call myself a woman.
Not even a woman. We don't care about women anymore. A trans woman.
I call myself a woman. I'm a dude. I call myself a woman. That trumps everything else. And it's the one of them that you can 100% opt into on a whim. That's all it takes. I now call myself, I'm gonna call myself a man. Call yourself a woman anytime you want. California's facilitating it. Other states presumably will follow. Surely there are people who are part of this who can see this and who have some power to help reverse it.
Yeah, to the extent that there are monsters, it's the category they will end up in because it is entirely discretionary by these new insane rules. Yeah. And, this is obviously, I think it's hard to be a decent human and be prepared for what's described here. And, Mandy, in her description, she wasn't prepared to write it.
Yeah.
It's that horrifying. But I think, sometimes I also say that to make compassionate policy requires dispassionate analysis. This is something, there's another formulation of it that I think was written before I ever said that, which I didn't know about. But anyway, I don't want to pretend that I made that up. I think
it was new with you, but
it was new to me, but
you.
Somebody else had said something so similar that it bears mention, and I wish I remembered who exactly it was. But that aside, the point is, this requires a dispassionate analysis. A dispassionate analysis says, you know what? The hypothesis was, if you changed the rules in this way, people would take advantage of it. People who were specifically not interested, were specifically interested in utilizing the change in the rules because of their rage at women, because of a desire to take advantage of this category. And this is the proof that that's true. You don't get to hide it, right? An honest analysis would say this is the exception and not the rule, which may be true. This exception proves why we cannot have a rule that allows such exceptions. But you don't get to pretend it didn't happen, right? By not writing the story or by making excuses for this person specially.
But apparently you do.
Yeah. Well, apparently you do.
Apparently you do get to pretend it didn't happen. But that is part of why in this season, when it would be great not to be talking or thinking about any of this, we have spent our time here today talking about some true horrors that are one of the downstream effects of the place that we started. With Stanford's list of bad words seems trivial in comparison, but that leads to this. It does.
Yeah. It
does. If you really become confused about whether or not you're assigned sex at birth, or I mean, using the word seminal is offensive. The people making these lists and policing them and making their living doing this kind of thing really need to build something with their hands, or plan a long hike, like a week, better a month, 3 months. Go somewhere outside of the country that you were born in, somewhere very different, with a language that you don't speak, and culture and food that you don't know, and make a go of it. Like, experience things that you can't socially manipulate yourself into convincing yourself that you got this. Because if these are the kinds of lists and policies you're making, you don't got this. You're really confused.
Yeah, I would add one thing to it. There is a general change in the way we make policy now. And the general change is an argument carries the day. We ignore why it carries the day. Why did this argument about gender identity carry the day? Because of power. It was not a good argument ever. Mm-hmm. But it carried the day because of power. But here's the thing that really troubles me. How much evidence would you need before you realize that there was something wrong with the argument to begin with? Right? A rational entity pulls out of a nosedive, right? At some point, it becomes clear that the instrument that said you were flying horizontally is wrong, and you ignore it and you pull out of the dive, right? Mm-hmm. We are now in a situation where the wrong argument gets to win no matter how much evidence accumulates that it wasn't a good argument in the first place. And this is now true effectively across the board, right? Okay, you inoculated how many people with this thing which didn't do what you said it did and did a lot of things that you told us it didn't do, right? At what point do we...
We're now talking about literal inoculations.
We're talking about literal inoculations. At what point do we get to say, you know what? The amount of evidence that what you told us about these things was wrong in every regard is now so great, we're not listening to what you say about whether or not it's still something we should be giving to people because you turned out to be wrong, right? And this is now happening on every topic, right? The people who had the power to get their argument to carry the day, in spite of the fact that they didn't know what they were talking about, get to be right in the end, even if all of the evidence says they weren't, right? Somehow they are entitled to be right, rather than advancing these things as a proposal. The point is, oh, they've already concluded that they were right, and the evidence will have to be refigured in order that they get to retain that status of being right. They were right to begin with, they remain right, and it's nonsense. Logic has never worked this way. This has to be the flavor of this new dark age, because that's the only case in which you would not allow the actual evidence to change your position, right? The position is what it is for reasons that have nothing to do with what's true.